So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Covenant Family Solutions is an innovative provider of mental and behavioral health care services based in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We offer therapy and medication management for individuals, couples, and families. CFS has 4 clinics located throughout Iowa. We also serve individuals throughout the United States through Strengthen You, our virtual care platform. Today, we will be talking about grief and how grief and loss can impact the holidays. This is a season that is typically portrayed as a cheerful time of year. Despite the classic holiday movies or family traditions, a lot of families are being faced with empty seats at the table or less sets of hands helping to bake holiday treats. We are here today to talk about those losses and the changes that come with them. Before we do get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. First, our webinar will be recorded today, and we will be sending out a link later this week for you to be able to rewatch the presentation and be able to share with friends and colleagues. Next, all attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. If you do happen to have questions, please use the chat feature to submit them. We will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. If we do happen to run out of time to answer questions, we will respond to any remaining questions via email. If you are looking to get a CEU for today's presentation, the syllabus is on the event page. We'll also ask you to send an email to communications@covenantfamilysolutions.com to request a certificate, and my colleague is entering that email address in the chat right now so that you can all see it. Individual licensing requirements may impact whether or not this does qualify for a webinar, whether or not the webinar does qualify for a CEU credit in your state and for your particular licensure. All right. We also do welcome you to join us in the conversation online by tagging @CovenantFS and #CFS webinars in your tweets. Okay, just letting in a couple more people here. All right. Okay. So now I would like to go ahead and introduce you all to today's presenter. Tanner Clark is a licensed marriage and family therapist and has been providing mental health services for many years. He is currently pursuing his PhD in marriage and family therapy, and his studies include an emphasis in medical family therapy. Unfortunately, part of this involves being familiar with how grief and loss can impact the mental health of loved ones, especially during the holidays. Tanner, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you. Okay. Well, yeah, are we ready to go ahead and get started?
I think so. I'll let other folks in as they join.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. I know that this topic is probably hits close to home for us, either individually or maybe with people we work with or just people in our lives. As Anna was saying, this is often a difficult time of year for people. And I think in part because of the narratives and the expectations we have for what holidays look like. And it's just some new experiences for people sometimes with, as she was saying, maybe empty chairs at the dinner table, or just changes in families or changes in relationships that may make it difficult to actually get together and practice those traditions and those things that we're used to. So as we start looking at the topic, we're going to look at just a brief overview of different types of grief and loss. And you'll see them listed here, this idea of normal, and for us that's definitely in quotation marks, right? That even though we call it normal grief, it can vary a lot and look different for each person. And this idea of disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss. So we'll move forward and we'll talk through all of those. So again, this idea of normal grief, it is basically what we're thinking here is what we normally think of when we think of grief and loss. It is often associated with things like the death of a family member, or friend, or just close person, somebody that we knew. And it may look like a lot of different things. So we would never pretend that the way that one person grieves and the way that one person handles that loss has to look exactly like some set standard. So traditionally, some things we might think of are things like crying, changes in sleep and appetite. So the things we have listed here. and again, there's a lot of variation here. Um, and we'll talk about a little bit social considerations, as we mentioned before, this idea of how those expectations and ideas impact that. So the next one that we'll look at is this idea of disenfranchised grief. So the big thing here, and how we would differentiate this from what we would term normal grief, is that that sense of kind of social acknowledgement, right? So here we have some examples of, death of a pet, divorce, breakups, things that have a possibility of, if they're shared in certain contexts, that maybe not receiving the same level of compassion, maybe not the same level of understanding how difficult those things are to manage. I know in practice, oh man, often throughout different parts of the year, have people come in and recognizing that they're really upset, they're really struggling with something, and they initially don't want to share it, because they feel like it's, that it's just a silly thing to share, or that they shouldn't be as upset about it as they are. And a lot of times, I know that one of like death of a pet, that's one that I see a lot, that people will come in and say, I know I shouldn't be upset about it, or I know I shouldn't, um, be grieving like this, or I should be over it. Um, and I jump right into that conversation of, who says, right? Who says that you have to, or that you can't grieve the loss of your pet? I mean, this was like a family member for many people, but it just doesn't have that same level. So when we think of disenfranchised grief, it's a type of grief that doesn't have that same level of kind of social acknowledgement, and likely doesn't have the same level of kind of ritual and routine to help navigate us through that grief process. So the next type that we're looking at is ambiguous loss. And this can be a really difficult one to understand for a lot of people, especially, I think, with the way that grief is conceptualized in our communities and our society, right? So the big thing here is it's a type of loss that often has just a lot of uncertainty and maybe not clear closure. Right? Other research and other people who practice in this area describe it as something that freezes the grief process, and something that blocks coping and decision-making processes, something that doesn't have a clear and socially supported way of grieving, and may not even be a tangible loss. So as we consider the difference between what we might term normal grief and or normal loss, right, and ambiguous loss, one of the defining characteristics there might be that idea of how tangible is it, right? Because it's easier sometimes to conceptualize loss as the loss of a person, right, that someone has passed away. But the types that we include here of ambiguous loss, like two kind of broad ways of thinking about it, are this idea of physical absence with psychological presence, right? Or psychological absence with physical presence. So in both of those, there is kind of an uncertainty, right? Kind of a feeling and a draw of there but not there, and that tension and that uncertainty can make it hard to cope with, because I think we're often not really left, are not often taught how to manage and how to deal with those things. There's not as many kind of social rituals attached to these. So moving on, we'll look at some social considerations. So it was important for me to include these because I know that I personally, as a mental health professional, feel really strongly about how we conceptualize this idea of grief, and how we perpetuate some things that actually tend to be more harmful, I think, than helpful. So these are just some questions that I had, and encourage us to think about in considering kind of our own beliefs about grief, and about what that looks like, and what it means to kind of move through the grief process. So some things that come up, right? This idea of how many jobs have you had that included paid bereavement leave, right? And what does that say about how we value things like grief, and how we,
Oh, well.
as a community, support each other in those things, right? A big one for me is this idea of what types of language do you hear used? I know often in session, people will come in and tell me things like, I know everybody in my life says that I should be over this, or that I should get over this. And I don't tell them what they can't, or what they can and can't say necessarily, but I very much encourage different language, that it's not usually useful and helpful for us to conceptualize this about as how do I get over something, because that feels really invalidating, and really, especially when we're thinking about like the loss of a loved one, can feel disrespectful to their memory and disrespectful to the ways that they invested in our lives. So I often encourage people to think about language of not so much of how do I get over, but how do I make a place for, right? Or how do I continue to move forward, with this experience, right? That I encourage people to conceptualize it more as it's an experience that we've had, something that we need to attend to, something we need to validate and honor, and we need to find a special and honored place for that in our life. That it's not about getting over, and because that seems like it carries some idea of forgetting, and it's not that. So just some things to think about with questions about, just to reflect on our own ideas about normal grief. So in the next one for disenfranchised grief, again, this would be a type of grief, type of loss that may not enjoy the same level of social ritual and social acceptance, right? Not recognized and understood like normal grief we've discussed here. Some jobs, right, and specific careers might be really heavy in this type of grief, right? So we've included here, right, some losses might be minimized or stigmatized due to stigmatized by other people. And I think as we reflect on those things, or as we pay attention to how people sometimes react to the types of grief that aren't really clear cut and really tangible, like in kind of that normal grief process, that sometimes there's very negative languaging, there's just very negative stigma, not just about the event itself, but about the person experiencing that grief, right? Starting to question their character, starting to question their strength or their ability to move forward in good ways. So we'll move on the social considerations for ambiguous loss here. Again, we've talked about one of the defining characteristics here is not having clear socially supported way of grieving, and just confusion, uncertainty about the natural grieving process. So I often, when I'm working with somebody who's dealing with grief, we talk about how it feels like there is kind of a natural process to some of that normal grief in response to loss. And when we say kind of a normal or a natural process, I think a lot of times that's a very socially conditioned process. And as you think about that process for normal grief, there is a lot of expectations, right? Of, you go talk to funeral directors, you make plans for funerals, you sit with family and talk about good times you've had, gone through pictures, those kind of things. And these types of ambiguous loss that are other, right, that may look like loss of perceived future, right? So, or a loss of my perception of myself due to maybe illness or due to just change in life circumstances. May look like a loss of relational functions or just relationships in general, a loss of belief or perception about who I am, or in certain important belief systems, that those things don't have as clear support as like the loss of a loved one. So we want to apply this to the holidays because, again, the There's a lot, and I think none of us would argue, even just the past few years, there's been a lot going on. There's been a lot of opportunities for new struggles, for different kinds of grief and loss that we didn't really give any thought to potentially. So they could be really difficult experiences, even just in that normal grief process alone, right? Maybe the first set of major holidays for people without a certain loved one, um, or without access to certain family members, or moving to a new city and not having family around you, missing out on first experiences with grandkids, or all those type of things. We see it definitely attests to an increase in things like anxiety and depression symptoms. And especially, I think, for kids, that idea of behavioral symptoms. And I really, my wife is a public school teacher, so we talk a lot about when we see changes in children's behaviors throughout the year. And I think the holidays can be a really big one. I mean, number one, because obviously breaks are coming up and things like that, but also because they may be dealing with things like the loss of a loved one, or things like, I don't get to see my cousin this Christmas because mom and her sister are fighting, right? Or I don't get to see my new baby cousin because they live far away, or they're out of the country, right? So those types of loss that again are maybe not as tangible, but exist and impact us. This part again is something that I just encourage us to think about, these standard narratives. So that holidays are often times that we're told to be thankful, time for family to come together, and for cozy days with loved ones, watching holiday movies over and over. If you're my in-laws, watching the same movies over and over while you're drinking hot chocolate and you're enjoying the treats that we made for the holiday dinner. That all those standard narratives that do often bring us a lot of comfort, but also don't necessarily reflect the experience that everybody has in this time. And I think if we only abide by those standard narratives, if we don't leave room for the experience of other people who have just experienced and are struggling with different things, that we're not honoring their experience well, and not being all that helpful to them. So I think that leaving room for those different narratives is very helpful, and for considering that not everybody has that same experience over the holidays, right? Yeah, again, here the reality of the holidays, that feelings of loss about may impact what we feel like we're thankful for, or may feel like the things that we should be thankful for don't matter in the face of the things that we feel like we've lost, right? It's really easy for us to have that kind of scale idea of, does the good outweigh the bad, or does the bad outweigh the good? And then, living accordingly. And life can definitely be more complex than that. It doesn't have to be a set of scales like that, but can often feel that way. So again, things of family members who have passed away, just family members or loved ones who aren't accessible during this time. And maybe that idea of accessibility isn't because of anything that we've done. Could be conflicts with other family members, could be they're just have moved and living in a different part of the state or country, maybe don't have the resources, or maybe it's the issue of a newly married couple, and I can't spend Christmas Day with both families because they live in different states, and dealing with those feelings of loss, right? So this idea of consider your resources, so trusted friends or family members, and I always emphasize trusted, just because I don't generally encourage anybody to be really vulnerable with people that they don't feel like they can trust. So in those times of struggle, absolutely, people you feel like you can trust, community resources, religious or cultural groups, right, that may be celebrating the holiday in certain ways, or hosting some kind of get-togethers. Definitely therapy. Meeting with a therapist does not have to be a long-term commitment. I know sometimes it looks that way on TV shows, that it has to be a 6-month or a year process, but it doesn't. It could be a brief, really focused thing to help get through the holidays and to help kind of process what the holidays will look like and how I'll deal with my feelings of grief and loss. Another important thing that I encourage people a lot is this idea of developing rituals, because again, one of the really helpful things about what we term normal grieving is that it does have some level of ritual. Not always the most helpful ritual, not always rituals that people feel like are the most meaningful or impactful, sure, but they have some level of socially accepted ritual. So I found a study that talked about these three support functions of rituals. And so number one is this idea of continuation of the connection with a lost loved one. And that may play into spiritual resources for people or for families. This idea that loss is more of a see you later than a goodbye type of scenario. Or just that, the relationship doesn't necessarily end just because they're not physically with us. And this idea of a ritual helping us to transition to a new role, a new social role. So that may be, my new role as a single parent, or my new role as maybe kind of the leader in my family. Any kind of new role we take on based in loss that the family system has experienced, right? And this idea of transformation of sense of self to accommodate a changed relationship, right? So this idea of who am I, and kind of what's important to me, what things do I value in the face of this loss, right? Especially the loss of really close people and really close relationships can really bring up those questions. And so developing a ritual that helps attend to that and helps to just kind of process through and think of ideas of what that can look like are very important for us. So when we're thinking of rituals and constructing rituals, so some helpful properties are this idea of structure, right? So that it has a sense of kind of beginning and end, right? The study called it a focused and time-limited activity to allow for channeling and containment of grief and associated emotions, right? So it has a meaningful structure to it. This idea of symbolism, whatever's important to us, maybe from a religious perspective, or just from a family perspective. I've seen in the past number of years, things like the symbolism of like carrying someone's ashes in certain jewelry, or maybe I've seen like teddy bears for like younger kids, things like that. And that can feel really important, and I can give that sense of connection or continued connection. These others, the ritual being social, right? Again, with people that we trust and that we that care for us, and that we know have our best interests in mind, right? So including them as appropriate, and being unique. So it doesn't have to be just something you found on Pinterest and said, I'm going to follow this step by step. It's whatever fits you, right? And sometimes it is that thing that we found on Pinterest. Sometimes it looks nothing like that. Sometimes that's an idea that sparks something else, but just being unique to each individual's needs. And then I included being intentional about the ritual, because no matter what kind of planning or what kind of encouragement that we think that a ritual will be, being intentional about actually doing it is really important, right? And that's the thing that no one can force on us, right? The decision to heal and the decision to grieve in an appropriate way, in a helpful way, is completely up to us. So we have to be intentional about understanding our need for that, and to move forward and do it. So this idea of helping our kids cope, I included this well-known phrase, right? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. This idea that kids do cope with things differently, they process things differently, but really, I think it's appropriate for us to consider our own needs, right? That in those moments of heavy grief, that we feel like we need to be comforted, we need to feel heard, we need to be understood, validated, or valued in some way. Kids need those things too. They need it in different ways, and they need to process through that in different ways, but they need it. So I think the needs for adults and kids are often not so dissimilar. It's just the ways that we meet those needs. So connecting in ways that make sense to them. Play for children, absolutely. Um, in my own experience with my daughter, we just had a cousin of mine pass away earlier this summer, and I saw that theme in her play a little bit right as we were playing with toys. This theme of not having someone with us, this theme of loss. And for her, that wasn't just, for our children, that's not just some way of, replaying for no purpose. It's a way of processing and understanding a complex idea that maybe their first experience with, right? And that's related to this idea of discuss grieving rituals soon and often, because kids need that time to be able to kind of process for themselves and ask questions and develop some sense of understanding, because it's a very complicated concept. So one of the things that we really try to highlight here again is that the grief and loss, it affects us all differently. And my personal hope is that at the very least, something that we take away and that we practice through this holiday season is this idea of it can be different, and that's okay. And I can show compassion to people who grieve in different ways and support them through with their own needs.
Right. Thank you so much, Tanner. This is all such good information. Now's the time where we invite anyone to submit questions that you might have for Tanner. So we'll give you a couple minutes to put those in. I know we're running close on time, but I want to give people a little bit of time to ask questions so that we can answer a few of those. While you're doing that, I do also want to let you know about our holiday worksheet bundles that we have in place. Those are available at covenantfamilysolutions.com. These can be really helpful year round, but they can especially be helpful during the holiday season in coping with things that might come up during the holiday season: anxiety, self-esteem issues. There's all sorts of social shall we say, challenges that come up around the holiday times, and especially with the very volatile situations that we have going on at present. And like I said, these are for lots of different things, both during the holidays and outside of it, but we do have those bundles going on right now. So we definitely would encourage you to hop on there and get some of those. I do have a couple of questions here, so we'll start with one. And just so you know, when you submit the questions, if you don't want everybody to see it, you can tell it to just submit to the presenter so that it's kept confidential. So the one question I have here is that this individual's sister is struggling a lot more visibly than they are with the loss of their dad. How can they help? How can they help her?
Yeah, absolutely. In a number of ways. I always encourage, especially those kind of relational things, ask, right? And probably you've done that. And they may or may not have told you certain things that they would need or would be helpful. But in the moment when you're physically there with them, sometimes just that presence together, even if it's not talking about anything in particular, maybe it's not crying together or anything like that. Maybe it's just that presence together can be helpful. And often for people, that validation of, I see this is really hard for you. And, even if we're in different places, even if we have different understandings or ways of coping or whatever, like I validate what you're going through, and I want you to know that I'm here for you in whatever meaningful and reasonable capacity that I can be. So very, very individualized, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so important, like you're saying, Tanner, nobody's experience is the same. And if someone is feeling, quote unquote, like they should be in a certain place, that can make it even that much harder. So really good advice there. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that permission sometimes just to feel it and that it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. One other question here, and then we'll probably have to sign off for for today, since we are running close on time. This person is struggling to explain a death by suicide to their child. How do they know what's okay to say?
Yeah, that's a great idea, or a great question. Um, I think there can be a lot of answers to that. One thing that I like to do, especially for younger kids, and I don't see an awful lot of younger kids, but I definitely have had that experience of those things. Might look into things like books. So like we said, kids learn a lot through things like the story and through the play and process of those kind of things. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but doing some research on maybe books with that kind of topic that are geared towards helping children kind of understand. And you might decide that it's less important for somebody, for one of our children to know the circumstances of someone's death, and maybe just focus more on it was a loss. And so maybe sometimes the specific circumstances might feel too much, depending on the child's age, but validating the loss and explaining through whatever your family belief system is about what that means and what happens when we lose someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Such good advice. And the holidays can be a really tough time, and we definitely see a spike around this time of year of people really facing some really dark thoughts and dealing with some very difficult things, especially with all of the losses, that tangible or intangible, that everyone has experienced over the last 2 years during this pandemic. So definitely please reach out if you're needing support for yourself. Please connect those that you love to resources. We have lots of resources on our website and through our local services and virtual services. So please don't ever feel like you have to be alone in this. There are lots of folks out there that are ready and willing to help. This is the end of today's webinar. We do really hope that this information has been very helpful and provides you with some reassurance and tips for navigating grief and loss during the upcoming holiday season. Our next webinar will be in the new year. We're going to take a break during the holiday season. So our next webinar will be on January 19th. Do keep an eye on your inbox for information about that webinar coming up and who our topic and presenter is going to be. We're still finalizing that. And as everyone likes to say, see you next year. Thanks, everyone.